Hi, I'm Bruce Daisley. Last month, you might have seen it, there was a survey in the press of 1,000 British workers that said that since COVID, the majority of people were willing to take a pay cut if they could carry on working from home some of the time. And when asked, it was quite substantial actually, when asked, the average pay cut was 14%. In fact, older workers said that they were much more willing to take a bigger pay cut. So it shouldn't really come as a huge surprise for us. For a long time, we knew that workers had a conflicted relationship with their commute. We always knew that workers who could walk to work were willing to take a 20% pay cut. And, just something that we've probably forgotten in the last year, but the average commute in the UK was just under an hour. In fact, in London, it was 74 minutes. And of course, that's each way. So in hindsight, maybe we'll all look back and wonder, why did we waste 2 hours a day getting to a different desk just to do emails there? I think that might be one of the big questions that we ask ourselves from COVID. So that survey wasn't definitive, but it's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing elsewhere. It seems that the pandemic has genuinely opened our eyes to what we could be doing differently. Since the start of 2021, the FT has reported that 50% of firms are reporting reducing their office space. And in fact, a similar piece of work by Bloomberg ran a search of earnings calls, and they found that a sizable chunk of CFOs were reporting reducing their office footprint in the next 12 months. In fact, going further, KPMG did a survey of 1,300 chief execs, and 2/3 of them said that they planned to downsize their office. So it seems that our offices are going to be smaller, but there might be bosses who are left wondering, well, if my workers are working from home, how will I know they're working? And this comes down to the fundamental question that we've often wrestled with about productivity. It sort of begs the follow-up question, what were you doing before to know that they were working before? The idea that we measure productivity with our eyes is a risky business. It's worth giving you some of the stats that we know about work and our relationship with work. Gallup, the polling company, they've got a colossal workplace survey that runs worldwide, and that measures workplace engagement. Globally, the average engagement with our jobs worldwide is 13%. So that means while that person you looked at who looked busy and they looked like they were doing their jobs, there was a very high chance they were just shuffling papers, emailing friends, sorting out domestic responsibilities. So I guess the long overdue question is whether we can measure productivity in a better way. And there's a couple of interesting pointers for us here. Firstly, at the start of lockdown, back in May 2020, that same Gallup survey saw a leap in engagement. That figure I talked about of 13%. If you cast your mind back, that was a really interesting time of resourceful reinvention. I've chatted to loads of organisations through lockdown. I chatted to one local authority that was pretty representative of what we saw elsewhere. They'd had to buy laptop computers for everyone. All their employees had to find a way to log on to securely access private data. Really critical. And what we learned about that was a management style that was command and control just couldn't do it. There just wasn't enough time to make that work. To work, firms had to empower their workers to make decisions. I spoke to them a month later, and they told me how delighted they'd been that everyone had stepped up and made this work. And you probably recognise that because I heard that from companies across the whole of the UK, across Europe and some US firms. So like I say, that Gallup survey saw a huge leap in engagement at the start of lockdown. And it should be instructive for us. This gives us a real indication about how we're motivated at work, how we draw strength from our jobs. It's all about control. What we know is that when we gift greater autonomy to workers, their engagement goes up. You can sort of imagine a situation. Imagine a child sitting at a motorised toy. And if they push all the buttons and nothing happens, they'll quickly disengage with it. But if they push a button and the toy moves, they'll immediately lean forward to understand how it works. And that's what it's like with work. We're very similar to that. If you give people boring, repetitive jobs that don't require their intellectual input, they disengage. It's like the first lockdown though. If we give them problems to solve, they generally lean forward and try and deal with them. So what we do know about the first lockdown is that workers became so engaged that they, to some extent, ended up working too hard. A lot of workers reported becoming burnt out. Burnout is recognised by the World Health Organization. It's a genuine condition, but it seems that there's a balance to be struck. In normal times, having control is an important part of us feeling engaged with our job. But really critically, it's also a really important part of how we feel resilient. And we know this because we have really strong evidence. In fact, in research, when we've looked at nurses who've worked long hours, their burnout is strongly different depending on whether they've elected to do those long hours. When we're in control, when we feel like we're in charge of things, when we're in the driving seat, it seems to give us more strength, it seems to give us more protection. Now, the subject of resilience is obviously one that we've really heard a lot about this year. And actually, when we're studying it, there's a lot of lessons that we can heed. One thing I discovered, I've spent the whole of lockdown really trying to understand the research and the academic literature into resilience. And one of the things that we know is that we make a fundamental mistake of it. To me, it's the myth of resilience. We treat resilience like it's an individual strength that can be summoned. In fact, we hear such and such needs to be more resilient. This person needs to be more resilient. I was on a radio discussion in the end of last autumn with Robert Peston. And he used it in a classic way. He said, the thing about young people, they need to be more resilient. And here's the interesting thing, actually. If you delve into the evidence, it seems that resilience isn't this individual strength or even a character trait that some of us have got. It's a collective strength. It's a collective strength that comes from us feeling that we can draw on the support of other people. So I mentioned before that when we're talking about engagement, there's an importance of control, but we see that exhibited when it comes to resilience. Control is one of the critical parts of us showing this strength, of us showing this ability to respond and bounce back. But there's two other critical components. They are identity and community. In fact, quite often when psychologists talk about them, they put them together. They call them our social identity. What that means specifically is how we relate to others as part of a group. Back in the ancient realms of social science, there was a really famous experiment that you've almost certainly heard about. You'll have seen it on documentaries, you'll have seen it on TV shows. It's the Stanford Prison Experiment. And you'll have heard of it because the researchers took a group of students and they gave them different roles. They gave them roles of either being a guard or a prisoner. And it became famous because the students involved very quickly became assimilated into those roles. And unfortunately, they behaved in really shocking ways. And like a lot of social science that followed in the aftermath of World War II, it sort of harked back to what we'd witnessed in the Second World War. And it was so impactful that science was reluctant to repeat it. Until about 15 years ago, when the BBC asked two social scientists to capture it on camera. The really interesting thing is the results were very different. They found that some things were true that were completely different to what was in the first experiment. Here's how it worked. Well, firstly, the roles for the participants were chosen at random. So you either turned up and found you were a guard or turned up and you found you were a prisoner. Now, of course, it's worth putting the context of when this took place. The guards knew that the experiment was going to be on BBC, so they became very conscious of their role. And, to some extent, were a bit ashamed to be giving orders on screen. This was right after the first series of Big Brother. So if anyone remembers that and the infamy that Nasty Nick achieved, well, you can understand why someone who's going into this didn't want to be giving out orders on screen. But what the researchers discovered was that there was a real contrast between the way that the groups developed a character. The prisoners, surprisingly, as the subservient group, developed a real sense of connection with each other. Initially, they were just delighted to be on the naughty step. And then, in the face of the guards' embarrassed disassociation with each other, their self-esteem grew. What you discovered was that the guards were embarrassed to be on TV. Some of them were giving orders. The others were really uncomfortable with those orders. And so you started seeing this chasm in their identity separate. The prisoners' pride in their free-spirited identity expanded, sort of puffed their chests in delight. They were making mischief. As the experiment went on, the researchers were measuring the stress levels of the people involved and the happiness of the participants. And they observed that there was a real divergence between the two different groups. I mentioned that not all of the guards felt self-conscious, and the ones who were embarrassed found themselves in an awkwardness, in the daily sort of conflict with those who wanted to be strict with the prisoners. On average, in the course of the experiment, the stress levels of the guards, the superior group, went up as their lack of faith, their lack of faith in their identity grew, and they sort of felt distanced from the values of their group. On the other hand, the prisoners showed a real improvement. They ended up forming something of a prisoners' union. They were refusing to participate in various things. They were talking about striking. It was this carnival of chaos. Anyway, as time went on, their anxiety levels dropped. They reported feeling genuinely happy, despite the fact they were sort of meant to be the prisoners. They were meant to be locked up. They were meant to have limited freedom. On every single measure, the prisoners ended up being happier than the guards. One of them described himself as being as happy as a pig in shit. So like a genuine delight running through these people. Now, of course, you don't need me to tell you that wasn't how the experiment was meant to work, especially when we think back to the Stanford prison experiment. But we see repeatedly that when people feel proud of their identity, it makes them stronger. At the end of the experiment, at the end of this BBC experiment that they did, the prisoners reported feeling more able to cope than the guards. Effectively, the prisoners had shown more resilience in a stressful situation. And it's really important what we can learn from that. That social identity plays a really critical part in us understanding how firms can engage with their workers. Now, most of us haven't been around colleagues for 11 months. Some of the cues of social connection that we might have got from sitting next to someone have gone from our day-to-day life. And there's good evidence that the more we feel part of something, the more it actually impacts our mental and physical health. In other words, sort of being connected to other people does make us stronger. And I think that's not only the lesson of that BBC prison experiment, but it's also a lot of the lessons of social science. The way that one of the leading experts in the field talks about this, he says, for a long time, health professionals have spent a lot of time categorising this whole spectrum of mental health conditions. But it seems that the lack of social connection is the common denominator that underpins all of it. That's Alex Haslam. And he says, rather than sort of trying to think, do you have this disorder or this disorder? The question is more, are you disconnected from a sense of community? Obviously, those words, are you disconnected from a sense of community, are incredibly timely for this moment that we've gone through. But we see really good evidence on this. There was one fascinating longitudinal study that sort of studied patients who were their likelihood of getting depressed after an operation. And they studied what were the things that triggered it. And the answer, pure and simple, was, were the patients member of any groups? If they didn't previously belong to a social group, their chance of getting depression after an operation was pretty high, about 41%. But the more groups you belong to, then the lower your chance of relapse. It's not just depression. Researchers have found the same thing in patients who've had heart attacks, patients who've had strokes. So we tend to draw strength far more than we imagine from being connected to other people. Strangely then, the best way for any of us to feel stronger is to feel connected with people that we identify with. That's social identity. So back to the workplace. Obviously that might feel like an excursion into social science, but all of those things are really relevant for us. Firstly, if we are asking our employees to be resilient, understanding those components seems really critical. What are those components? Control, identity, and community. A sense of us feeling social connection to the people around us. So when we hear bosses demand a resilient response, we often don't hear discussions of those things. When we hear CEOs asking employees to be resilient, maybe rather than asking their employees to be resilient, they need to be asking the question, how can we make our team members feel more able to make decisions? How can we make them feel more respected for their unique approach? How can we make them feel more supported by their colleagues? Really interestingly, I think we've found the whole of work upended and we've found a massive amount of disruption. And the question, of course, has become, what can employees do to be more resilient? But I think if we were in a situation where colleagues can't control their calendar, they don't feel their values are respected, they don't feel part of something they can feel proud of, they disengage. So while we've seen a whole load of change, I think the nature of life is that we can make the mistake of thinking that the change is all behind us. In fact, there's a whole load of change to come. And I think what we do know is that post-COVID, we're going to have to rethink how our organisations work. There's no doubt that firms who are really clear about how this resilience is created are going to prosper and do much better in the future.